My son-in-law stood on the deck of the boat, laughing with his brothers, and told them, loud enough for everyone at the dock to hear, that I was just along for the ride this summer, same as always. He said it in a friendly voice, like it was a joke. But it was not really a joke. It was what he actually believed about me. I was sitting near the back of the boat at the time, holding a cup of coffee, watching the water. I did not say anything. I just smiled a small, quiet smile and looked out at the marina. What my son-in-law did not know, what almost nobody in that family knew, was that my name had been on the deed to that marina slip for 20 years. Not his father's name. Not the family trust everyone talked about at holidays. Mine. My name is Adelaide Marchbanks. I am 68 years old. I have spent most of my life being the quiet one in every room. This is the story of the summer that quiet finally changed into something else. I want to start at the beginning, because I think you need to understand who I was before you understand what happened. I grew up in a small coastal town, the daughter of a fisherman named Elton Rourke and a schoolteacher named Wilhelmina. We did not have much money, but we had the water. My father took me out on his little wooden boat almost every weekend from the time I could walk, and by the time I was 10 years old, I could tie a proper knot faster than most grown men. I loved the smell of salt in the air. I loved the quiet slap of waves against the side of a boat early in the morning, before anyone else was awake. I married young, at 22, to a good, steady man named Halbert Marchbanks. Halbert worked as a marine engineer, the kind of man who understood engines the way some people understand music. We built a life together near the water, in a small town not far from where I grew up. We had one daughter, a girl named Prudence, who we called Prue for short. Halbert and I were not wealthy people in the way some families are wealthy. But we were careful. We saved. And over many years, Halbert built a small but steady business repairing boat engines for people up and down the coast. He was well known in our little town for doing honest, careful work, the kind that made boat owners trust him for decades. When Prue was 22 years old, she married a young man named Carrington Fenwick. Carrington came from a very different kind of family than ours. His father, Augustine Fenwick, had made a large fortune in real estate development, buying up land along the coast years before it became fashionable and expensive. The Fenwicks were the kind of family that owned a big house with a long driveway, the kind of family that had their names mentioned in the local newspaper for charity events. I want to be fair to the Fenwicks, because I do not think they were cruel people, not really. But they had a certain way of looking at the world that made it hard for someone like me to ever feel like I truly belonged. They measured things by size and by shine and by how impressive something looked from the outside. My husband's small engine repair shop, careful and honest as it was, did not impress them very much. My quiet way of speaking, my simple clothes, my habit of listening more than talking, did not impress them either. I remember the early years of Prue and Carrington's marriage quite well, because they were, in many ways, easier years for me than the ones that came later. Halbert was still alive then, and Halbert had a way of filling a room simply by being in it. He was not a loud man, not exactly, but he had a steady confidence that came from decades of skilled work, and people naturally listened when he spoke. Augustine Fenwick respected Halbert, in his own careful way, even if he never fully understood him. I remember Augustine once asking Halbert, at an early family dinner, how someone could stand doing the same careful engine repair work for so many years without wanting something bigger. Halbert had simply smiled and said that fixing something well, so a family could get safely out on the water and back home again, felt plenty big enough to him. Augustine had not quite known what to say to that, but I could tell it stuck with him, in a small way, over the years. With Halbert beside me at those early gatherings, I did not notice how quiet my own role had become, because his presence seemed to cover for both of us. I would sit near him, listening, and it did not feel like being overlooked. It felt simply like being part of a pair, the way we had always been since we were young. Halbert passed away 12 years ago, from a sudden illness that took him quickly, without much warning. I was 56 years old when I became a widow. It was one of the hardest years of my life. Prue helped me through the worst of the grief, and I will always be grateful for that. But in the years that followed, something changed slowly in how the Fenwick side of the family treated me. Without Halbert beside me, without his steady, respected presence in the room, I began to feel more and more like a guest at my own daughter's family gatherings, rather than a true part of things. Carrington was not unkind to me exactly. I want to make that clear, because this story is not really about cruelty. It is about something quieter than cruelty. It is about being overlooked year after year until being overlooked simply becomes the shape of your life and nobody, including you, thinks to question it anymore. Every summer, the Fenwick family gathered at a marina about 40 minutes from their big house, where they kept a large family boat, a beautiful vessel that had belonged to Augustine for many years. They called these summer gatherings boat days, and the whole extended family would come together, aunts and uncles and cousins, spending long afternoons out on the water, coming back in the evening for a big dinner at the Marina restaurant. I was always invited to these gatherings because Prue insisted on it, and because it would have looked strange, I think, for the family not to invite Halbert's widow. But I noticed, over the years, a particular pattern in how I was treated once I was there. I was rarely asked to help steer the boat, even though I had grown up on the water and could handle a boat as well as anyone in that family. I was rarely asked my opinion about where to anchor, or how the weather looked, or which route made the most sense. I was simply there, sitting quietly near the back, holding my coffee, watching the water the way I always had, while conversations happened around me rather than with me. I did not complain about this for many years. Partly because I am simply a quiet person by nature, someone who has always found more comfort in watching than in speaking up. And partly because I told myself again and again that it did not matter, that being present was enough, that I did not need to be included in every conversation to still belong to this family. I remember one boat day, about 5 years ago, when a sudden squall moved in faster than anyone expected, dark clouds rolling across the water in a way that told me, from years of experience, that we needed to head in immediately. I mentioned this quietly to Carrington, who was staring at the time, but he waved it off, saying the weather report he had checked that morning showed clear skies through the evening. I did not push the point, though I knew, from the particular color of the clouds and the sudden stillness in the air, that the weather report was already out of date. 20 minutes later, the storm hit hard, and we spent a frightening half-hour getting everyone safely back to the dock, soaked through, the children crying, Augustine gripping the rail with white knuckles. Afterward, nobody mentioned that I had warned them. Nobody asked how I had known. It simply became a story the family told about that scary storm, with no mention of the quiet woman near the back who had tried to say something first. I thought about that day often, in the years that followed. Not with anger, exactly, but with a kind of tired recognition. It was not that the family disliked me. It was simply that they had never built the habit of turning to me for anything, so even when I offered something true and useful, it slid past them, the way water slides past a rock it has already decided is simply part of the scenery. But there is something I need to explain now, something almost nobody in the Fenwick family knew. When Halbert and I were young and first married, before Prue was even born, we bought a small piece of property near the water, not far from where the marina now stood. It was not fancy land. It was simply a strip of shoreline with a small dock, land that nobody wanted very much at the time because the town had not yet grown up around it. We bought it cheaply, with almost all our savings, because Halbert had a feeling, even back then, that the coastline in our area would someday become valuable. He was right. Over the following decades, the town grew. A proper marina was built, right on and around the shoreline we owned. The marina company that built it needed to lease certain slips of water and dock space from private landowners, including us, in order to expand their operation fully. Halbert and I signed a long-term lease agreement with the marina many years ago, one that gave the marina company the right to operate on our land, in exchange for a steady monthly payment to us, along with the marina's promise to maintain and improve the property over the years. When Augustine Fenwick first bought his family's boat and needed a slip to keep it in, he leased space from the marina, the same as many other boat owners in town did. He never knew, and honestly never asked, that the actual underlying land his boat sat on, the actual deed beneath that slip, belonged to a quiet widow named Adelaide Marchbanks, not to the marina company itself. which simply operated as a leaseholder managing the property on our behalf. I never told the Fenwick family about this. I want to explain why, because I think it matters. It was not because I was trying to hide something shameful. It was simply never relevant to bring up. Halbert had died. Prue knew, of course, because it had been our family's land for decades, part of what Halbert left to both of us when he passed. But the details of a Marina lease agreement are not exactly the kind of thing that comes up naturally at a family dinner. And, honestly, some quiet part of me, if I am being fully truthful, liked having this one thing that was mine alone, something the Fenwick family's usual way of measuring people by size and shine could not touch or diminish, because they simply did not know it existed. For years, this quiet arrangement continued without any trouble. The Marina company managed the property well, paid their lease payments to me faithfully every month through a property manager I trusted, a careful man named Ignatius Delacroix, and the Fenwick family continued keeping their boat at the Marina, never once thinking to ask deeper questions about who actually owned the ground beneath their slip. The comment that changed everything happened this past summer, on a warm Saturday afternoon, at the beginning of what should have been an ordinary boat day. We had all gathered at the Marina in the late morning, the whole extended Fenwick family, along with me, standing near the back of the group the way I usually did. Carrington was in a good mood that day, laughing with his two brothers, Thaddeus and Reginald, as they loaded coolers and folding chairs onto the boat. I climbed aboard carefully, the way I always did, finding my usual spot near the back, out of the way. I remember Carrington glancing over at me as I settled in and saying, to his brothers, in a warm, teasing voice that was not meant to be cruel but landed that way anyway, "Adelaide's just along for the ride this summer, same as always. Somebody's got to enjoy the view while the rest of us do the actual work." His brothers laughed. It was not a mean laugh, exactly. It was the kind of easy, careless laugh that happens when people have decided, without ever really thinking about it, exactly what role someone plays in the family, and they simply accept that role without question. I sat there for a moment, coffee cup warm in my hands, and I felt something old and tired settle over me. 12 years of being the quiet widow at the back of the boat. 12 years of watching conversations happen around me instead of with me. 12 years of being seen, in the kindest interpretation, as sweet but not especially useful, and in the less kind interpretation, as simply someone who came along because it would look strange not to invite her. I did not say anything that day. I smiled my small, quiet smile, the one I had perfected over many years, and I looked out at the water, the way I always did. But something inside me had shifted, quietly, the way a tide shifts, slow and steady, without much noise at first. I want to explain what happened next carefully, because I do not want this to sound like some grand plan I cooked up in a fit of anger. That is not what happened. What happened was slower and more thoughtful than that. About 2 weeks after that boat day, I received a phone call from Ignatius Delacroix, my property manager, letting me know that the Marina company was requesting a meeting to discuss renewing the long-term lease agreement, which was set to expire at the end of that year. He explained that the Marina had grown considerably over the past decade, and that they wanted to discuss new terms, given how much more valuable the waterfront property had become since the original lease was signed many years earlier. I agreed to the meeting, and Ignatius and I sat down together with the Marina's operations director, a careful, businesslike woman named Perpetua Ashgrove. She explained that the Marina wanted to renew the lease for another 20 years, and that given the significant increase in property values along the coast, they were prepared to offer considerably higher monthly payments than the original agreement, along with an improved maintenance schedule for the dock and slip areas. I listened carefully, and I asked good questions, the kind of questions Halbert had taught me to ask many years earlier when we first started dealing with property leases. Near the end of the meeting, almost as an afterthought, I asked Perpetua a simple question. I asked her whether the Marina's records showed exactly which boat owners were leasing space, specifically within the section of the Marina built on my property, the section closest to the water's edge. She pulled up her records and told me the answer without much hesitation, because there was no reason for her to think it was a sensitive question. The Fenwick family's boat slip, the one Carrington and his brothers used every single summer, sat directly within the property that belonged, quietly, to me. I did not react strongly to this news, because in truth, I had already suspected it. Halbert and I had walked that shoreline together many times over the years, and I remembered, even then, roughly where our property lines fell. What surprised me, honestly, was not the fact itself. What surprised me was how it made me feel, sitting there in that meeting room, hearing it confirmed out loud. A small, quiet strength settled into my chest, the kind of strength that comes not from anger, but from finally understanding something clearly that you had only half understood before. I want to be honest about what I considered doing in the weeks that followed, because I think honesty matters more than a clean, simple story. I considered, briefly, simply letting the lease expire without renewal, forcing the Marina, and by extension the Fenwick family's boat, to find a new location entirely. Some small, wounded part of me found a certain satisfaction in imagining that scenario, imagining Carrington's confusion when his family's boat suddenly had nowhere familiar to dock. But the more I sat with that idea, the less right it felt. I had spent my whole life being a careful, thoughtful person, someone who did not act out of hurt feelings alone. Halbert had taught me that patience and fairness usually served you better than quick, sharp reactions, even when those reactions might feel satisfying in the moment. I decided, instead, on a different path, one that felt more true to who I actually was. I renewed the lease with the Marina on the improved terms Perpetua had offered, ensuring the Marina, and everyone who leased space there, including the Fenwick family, could continue operating exactly as before. But I made one small change to how I wanted things handled going forward. I asked Ignatius to arrange a proper, formal meeting later that summer, where the actual property ownership could be clearly and openly explained to the Fenwick family, not through some dramatic confrontation, but through simple, honest paperwork, the kind that speaks for itself without needing anger behind it. The occasion came sooner than I expected. About a month after renewing the lease, the Marina experienced a genuine, serious problem. A significant storm moved through our coastal area in early August, causing real damage to several sections of the dock, including, as it happened, the exact section where the Fenwick family's boat was kept. The storm had loosened several pilings and damaged part of the walkway leading to their slip, making it unsafe to use until proper repairs could be completed. Perpetua called the Fenwick family directly, as she was required to under the Marina's normal procedures, to inform them of the damage and explain that repairs would need to be approved and coordinated, in part, with the underlying property owner, since certain structural repairs required the landowner's formal sign-off before work could begin. Carrington, I later learned, was quite frustrated by this news, assuming it meant unnecessary delay and red tape. He called the Marina office directly, asking, somewhat impatiently, exactly who this mysterious property owner was and why their signature was needed to fix a dock his family had used for years without any such complication. Perpetua, following the Marina's normal, straightforward business practice, simply told him the truth. The land underneath his family's boat slip belonged to Adelaide Marchbanks. I understand, from what Prue told me afterward, that Carrington was genuinely stunned by this information. He apparently called Prue immediately, asking her, with real confusion in his voice, whether she had any idea what Perpetua was talking about, whether his own mother-in-law could possibly own part of the Marina his family had used for decades. Prue, to her credit, was honest with him. She told him yes, it was true, that her father and mother had bought that shoreline property many years ago, long before the Marina was ever built, and that I had simply never made a point of mentioning it over the years because it had never seemed especially important to bring up. I want to describe what happened next carefully, because I think the way it unfolded matters more than the bare facts themselves. Carrington called me directly that same evening, his voice careful and a little unsteady, clearly working through some genuine surprise. He asked me, politely, whether it was true, whether I actually owned the land beneath the Marina's boat slips. I own the land beneath a section of the Marina, yes, I told him honestly, including the slip your family's boat has used for the past several years. There was a long pause on the phone. I had no idea, he finally said. Nobody ever mentioned it. I just always assumed the Marina owned everything outright. There was never really a good moment to bring it up, I told him, keeping my voice calm and even. It is simply a piece of property your father-in-law's family has been leasing space on, same as many other boat owners in town. It never seemed important until now, when the storm damage made it relevant. About the repairs, he said, a little hesitant now. Is there anything we need to do on our end to make sure everything moves forward smoothly? I told him the repairs would move forward exactly as they should, according to the Marina's normal procedures, and that there was no reason for any special worry on his part. I want to be clear that I never once used that storm damage or the repair approval process as leverage against the Fenwick family. I signed off on the necessary repairs promptly, exactly as I would have for any other section of the Marina, without any delay or complication. But something had shifted, quietly, in how Carrington understood our family and my place within it. A few days later, he called me again, this time not about the Marina repairs, but simply to talk. I've been thinking about that boat day, he said, his voice careful. What I said, about you just being along for the ride. Prue told me you heard that, and that it bothered you more than you let on at the time. I want you to know I never meant it as an insult, but I understand now why it landed that way. I appreciated that he brought it up himself, without me needing to say anything first. I think I told him honestly that for many years now, this family has decided, without really examining it closely, what kind of person I am. Quiet. A little old-fashioned. Someone who enjoys watching more than doing. Some of that is simply true, and I do not mind it about myself. But somewhere along the way, quiet got confused with unimportant, and watching got confused with contributing nothing. I have contributed plenty, Carrington, over many years, in ways this family has simply never bothered to notice. He was quiet for a moment on the phone. The land, he finally said. How long have you actually owned it? Since before Prue was even born, I told him. Your father-in-law, my husband Halbert, and I bought that shoreline together when we were young and had almost nothing else to our name. It was one of the smartest things we ever did, though it did not feel especially smart at the time. It simply felt like a piece of land nobody else wanted. I think, Carrington said slowly, that our family has always measured things by how big or shiny they look on the surface. My father's business, the big house, all of it. I never really stopped to think about what might be quietly sitting underneath all of that, holding things up in ways nobody bothered to look closely at. I told him I thought that was a fair thing to notice about his family and about himself. I want to explain what happened over the following weeks, because I think it shows something important about how real change in a family actually happens. It rarely happens all at once, in one dramatic moment. It happens slowly through small, repeated choices, made again and again, until a new pattern finally takes hold. The next boat day came about 3 weeks later, once the storm repairs were fully finished. I arrived at the marina the way I always did, expecting, honestly, that things might simply return to their old pattern, that the awkward phone call with Carrington might fade quietly into the background the way uncomfortable moments sometimes do in families that prefer not to dwell on things too long. But when I climbed aboard the boat that day, Carrington was waiting near the steering wheel, and he asked me, directly and without any teasing tone in his voice, whether I would like to help navigate that day. Since he remembered Prue once mentioning that I had grown up on boats along this very coastline. I want to describe how that felt, because I think it matters. It was such a small thing, really. Being asked a simple question. Being handed a small piece of real responsibility on a boat I had, in some quiet way, always partly belonged to, long before any of the Fenwick family ever set foot on it. But after 12 years of sitting quietly near the back, holding my coffee, watching the water while conversations happened around me, that small question felt like an enormous shift. I stepped forward and took the wheel for a stretch of that afternoon, guiding the boat carefully through water I had known since I was a small girl following my father out on his old wooden fishing boat. I felt, for the first time in a very long while, fully present in that family, rather than simply along for the ride. Over the following months, small changes like this continued. Carrington began asking my opinion about weather conditions before boat days, genuinely curious about what I noticed in the sky and the water that others might miss. His brothers, Thaddeus and Reginald, started including me more naturally in conversations, asking about my own history on the water, genuinely curious rather than simply polite. Even Augustine, Carrington's father, who I had always found the most distant and difficult to connect with, began treating me with a new kind of respect, one that felt less like careful politeness and more like genuine regard. I remember one particular afternoon, about 2 months after the storm damage was repaired, when Augustine himself asked to speak with me privately, away from the rest of the family, while the others were busy loading the boat with coolers and folding chairs. He led me a short way down the dock, and I remember feeling a little nervous, unsure what he wanted to say. "I've been thinking about your husband," he said, looking out at the water rather than at me. "Halbert." I asked him once why he never wanted something bigger than that little repair shop of his. I don't think I ever told you what he said back. I told him I remembered the story, that Halbert had mentioned it to me himself many years ago. "I thought about it as something small at the time," Augustine admitted. A modest answer from a modest man. It took me a long time, longer than I'm proud of, to understand that he wasn't being modest at all. He had simply built his whole life around something solid and useful instead of something big and shiny. "I think you did the same thing, Adelaide, all these years, and I never once thought to look closely enough to notice." I did not know quite what to say to that, so I simply told him I appreciated him saying it and that it was never too late to look more closely at the people around you. "The land," he said then, a little hesitant. "I want you to know, I never once doubted the paperwork or questioned your ownership, not for a moment, once Perpetua explained it. I only wish I'd known sooner, not because it changes anything about the lease, but because I think I would have treated you differently these past 12 years if I had understood, all along, how much you were quietly holding up around here." I told him that I did not need the family to treat me differently because of a piece of land or a lease agreement. What I had wanted all along was simply to be seen as a real part of things, regardless of what I owned or did not own. Augustine nodded slowly at that, and I think, for the first time in 12 years, he actually understood what I meant. I did not tell the wider family, right away, the full details of the Marina lease and property ownership. I did not need to turn this into some grand public reveal. Prue and Carrington knew, and that felt like enough for the moment. But the truth, once it existed quietly within the family, seemed to shift something deeper than the actual facts themselves. It was as though understanding that I had, all along, been quietly holding up something real and valuable, something the family had depended on without ever fully realizing it, made it easier for them to also recognize the other quiet things I had been contributing for years without much notice. The patient hours spent teaching Prue to swim as a small child. The steady presence at every family gathering, even when nobody thought to include me directly in the conversation. The simple, careful love I had continued giving year after year, whether or not anyone around me thought to notice it. I think about that boat day often, the one where Carrington's careless comment first landed on me. I do not think he meant real cruelty by it, and I have come, over these past months, to genuinely forgive him for it. But I also think that comment revealed something true about how easily families can decide, without ever fully examining it, exactly what role a quiet person plays in their lives. Present but not essential. Sweet but not especially useful. Along for the ride, rather than actually steering anything at all. What I learned, through the slow unfolding of that whole summer, is that sometimes the truth about a person's real value does not need to be announced loudly or proven through some dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it simply needs the right moment, an unexpected storm, a careful conversation, a small question asked at the wheel of a boat, to finally rise up to the surface where everyone can see it clearly. I still keep that same quiet nature I have always had. I still prefer listening to speaking, watching to talking. But I no longer sit at the back of that boat feeling invisible. These days, more often than not, Carrington asks me to help plan the route before we even leave the dock, and his brothers laugh with me now, rather than simply around me. Prue told me something a few weeks ago that I have carried close to my heart ever since. She said that watching me finally step forward that summer, taking the wheel, answering Augustine honestly on the dock, speaking up about the storm patterns without waiting to be asked twice, had taught her something important about her own life. She told me she had spent years, in her own marriage, quietly shrinking herself in small ways too, letting Carrington and his brothers make most of the decisions, assuming her own opinions mattered less simply because she had married into a louder, showier family. Watching her mother finally take up a little more space, she said, had given her permission to do the same. I did not expect that particular gift to come out of everything that happened that summer, but I think it may be the one I am most grateful for. It is one thing to finally be seen clearly yourself after so many quiet years. It is another thing entirely to watch that same clarity ripple outward, touching someone you love even more than yourself. I think, too, about my father, Elton, who first taught me to read the water when I was barely old enough to walk steady on a moving deck. He never had much money, and he never owned anything grand. But he taught me patience and care and the simple, steady value of paying close attention to things other people rush past without noticing. I did not fully understand, as a girl, that those lessons would shape the whole quiet architecture of my life, the careful land purchase with Halbert, the patient years of being overlooked, the slow unfolding of finally being understood. I think he would be proud of how that patience finally paid off, not in money, though there was some of that too, but in something harder to earn and far more valuable, which is simply being truly known by the people you love. Last month, near the end of summer, we took the boat out on a calm, clear evening, the whole extended family together, the water smooth and golden in the low evening light. Carrington stood beside me near the wheel, and he said, quietly, almost to himself, I used to think you just liked watching the water, Adelaide. I never once stopped to think about everything underneath it that you were actually holding up the whole time. I told him that was, in many ways, exactly the story of my whole life, and that I had made a kind of peace with it long ago, though it felt good, finally, to be truly seen. If someone in your own family decided, without ever really looking closely, that you were simply along for the ride, quiet and pleasant, but not especially essential to anything that mattered, what would you do? Would you speak up right away in the sting of that moment? Or would you do what I did, and simply let the quiet, steady truth of your own life rise up naturally, in its own good time, until it could no longer be overlooked?